This is Modelo Spring Football with James Wesley. I am Ari Tepkin. It's Big 12 today on Big 12 Radio, presented by Modelo. Modelo Spring Football, earned, not given. The full-time fan knows no off-season, which is why we bring you the Spring Caravan. Hop aboard as we head out to Ames, Iowa. We are presented by Modelo. Talk a little Iowa State football. Modelo's off-season fan rule number 31. Off-season doesn't mean off. It means research.
Research.
All right, so let's do a little research. Talk Iowa State football because a lot of research is needed here. You cannot understate the roster turnover here at Iowa State. More than 50 players entered the portal following Matt Campbell's departure, 16 of whom were starters in 2025. Iowa State brings back 0 starters of last year's squad and landed over 45 transfers from the portal. So, to put that in historical context, there was not a team in the country that lost as many starters from last year to the portal as the Cyclones. So this is a full-on reset. Now, there is precedent here with Jimmy Rogers because he just kind of did this at Washington State and helped Washington State get to a bowl game in year one despite a massive turnover in roster. And he even looked back on last year as a trying year for him, which you'll hear in our interview with him coming up, which is sort of surprising considering I would think a lot of people would look at it as a success, but shows you the standard that Jimmy Rogers has. Where do you want to start with this team because it's so new?
I would start with Jimmy Rogers. You know, this is a guy that was the head coach at South Dakota State for 2 years and was really the guy that got them over the hump in terms of ending North Dakota State's run as FCS national champs. He's 33-9 in 3 years, and that includes the 6-6 mark at Washington State. At Washington State, he had to bring in 75 newcomers. At Iowa State, that number's around 50. They do have about 40 returners, but they're guys that were buried on the two deep, to your point. All of the starters really like Matt Campbell. They follow him to Penn State. But what he did at Washington State, I think that would be kind of my launching point because at Oregon State, which was in a similar situation, the Pac-12 gets blown up. Those are the two leftovers. They don't have a league. They're trying to piece together a schedule. They actually played each other twice. Oregon State, 4 games into the year, fired their coach. They're a total mess. At Washington State, they were starting to build something. And I think that is Jimmy Rogers. I think he's a really underrated coach. But obviously it starts with all the turnover at Iowa State. I like the quarterback, Jalen Raynor, who they bring in from Arkansas State. He was the 2023 Freshman of the Year in the Sun Belt. He has some really nice numbers over the course of his career. And Iowa State obviously is familiar with him because they've played him the last 2 seasons in the non-conference. So those are kind of the bright spots, is Rodgers has done this before, and you've got a dual-threat quarterback who is a very legitimate dual-threat option as a runner.
Yeah, here is what Jimmy Rogers said about the transfer portal.
If you don't adapt, you're going to be dying in this profession. So for me, it's all about, is there a new way or a better way to do something? If there's not, then don't change it, right? If you're having success and you believe in it, don't change it because ultimately you're leading a team and they got to feel the belief that you have in the program in which you're guiding. And then there are things along the way that you have to adjust that you know aren't good enough. And that's always something that I've always prided myself on, that you got to find a different way to teach somebody certain things or a different system of getting information to players quicker so that they can learn and grow at a much faster rate. Because I would say in college football right now, with the rosters trimming to 105, you have to get players faster or get players ready faster. And that's giving them the information, how you give them the information, how you teach it to them, allowing them to absorb it, and then being able to correct them in order to play as quick as they possibly can. If they're good enough, they should be playing for you. That's our job as coaches, to teach them and give them the knowledge to impact the team quicker than you used to, I should say.
Yeah, great insight there from a coach that gets the modern era. I think this team will be better defensively than offensively. I think this year offensively will be a slog. It's not going to be the most aesthetically pretty offense, I think, but defensively they bring in Jesse Bobbitt, who is a former player for Rodgers at South Dakota State. He was the DC at Washington State, and they held opponents to just 20.2 points per game in 2025, including 13.5 points in the final 9 games. So you talk about teaching guys the scheme and having them, learn it quick. I think that's a pretty good example of it. They were number 15 nationally in total defense. And again, he took over in 1 year at Washington State and turned them to 15th nationally in total defense. They generated 31 sacks in the season. And, so that group with Jesse Bobbitt comes in, and it's mostly the same group from Washington State. They also bring in former Toledo co-defensive coordinator Ross Watson. So I think the continuity with the defensive staff, to me, lends itself to having a successful defense for Iowa State this year. Plus, that's obviously in Jimmy Rogers' bag, his defensive football. He's a defensive player. He was a defensive coordinator. Now, this is a good defensive outfit.
And Iowa State, I think, is going to be very similar to what Washington State was last year in that maybe not the most talented team in the league, but if you overlook them, they can be a real problem. Like Washington State had North Texas on the ropes in the non-conference. They had Ole Miss on the ropes in the non-conference. They almost beat Ole Miss. They bring in Cameron Petaway, a running back / special teams specialist, if you will, in terms of kick and punt returns from Bowling Green. He was the MAC Freshman of the Year last year, and he led the nation. And that's one area I've identified, special teams, where they could be really good. Cameron Petaway led the country in kick return averaged over 33 yards per kick return, and had a couple of kick return touchdowns. Then they bring in Omari Hayes, who's listed as a receiver from Tulane. He was at Florida Atlantic before that. Had over 500 yards receiving, second team All-American Conference as a punt returner. He's very dynamic. He also had some rushing numbers. He's a little guy, 5'9", but very shifty. And then I look in the trenches. That's another area that, maybe they're overmatched in terms of talent and size, but they do have some guys that could be really good. Like they bring in Jake Taylor, who's a transfer from Oklahoma. He's 6'6". He's massive. He was a highly rated 4-star recruit in 2022, but he's battled injuries and only played in 4 games last year at Oklahoma. But he's a high upside swing tackle if he can stay on the field. So there are some little things like special teams, offensive line that you just know Jimmy Rogers is like Matt Campbell. They're going to be rock solid in. But in terms of talent, yeah, there's a drop-off, no doubt.
Well, and when you look at the transfer portal, this is basically a MAC all-star team. Yeah. I mean, they've got all MAC guys everywhere. You mentioned Petaway. Masai King is an offensive tackle from Akron. Was a highly rated tackle in the MAC last year. Braden Owls from Toledo is maybe their best transfer portal addition, who's a first-team all-MAC safety who had was tied for 6th in the nation with 5 interceptions last year.
And he had an elite run defense grade from Pro Football Focus, among the best in the country, over 90.5.
So, can you turn a MAC All-Star team into a credible competitive team of the Big 12? Because that's what this is basically. Mm-hmm. Now, there's transfer players that come from outside the MAC, but for the most part, they got a bunch of guys from the MAC, which is a pretty notable football conference, but that's what they're up against, basically.
Right. And they've got Kyle Conrarty back at kicker. That's another little thing on special teams where they could be really good. Like defensively, they're going to look a lot different, but I just think under Jesse Bobbitt, they're going to be a problem. They're going to be assignment sound. They're going to have really outstanding communication. And then it's offensively, can they win the field position battle and kind of grind their way to 6 wins this year? That's the benchmark for me. If you get to a bowl game, which Jimmy Rogers has been in the postseason every year that he's been a coach, that would be a huge accomplishment for Iowa State.
Yeah, let's talk about the offense now. It's Tyler Roll who steps in. He comes back to Iowa State after spending a last year with Detroit and the Lions organization. And I think this is going to be a run-first offense. The question is who emerges, from an offensive line standpoint. They brought in 10 transfers on the offensive line, so they'll figure out who their 5 best are going to be, and there's some guys certainly that'll be in the conversation. But then it comes down to, is Cameron Petaway their lead back here as a guy that's, 5'10", 175 pounds, and seems more like a scat back because of what he can do in the return game?
No, I think it'll be running back by committee because they also have Sladaheen Allah, who's a transfer from Oregon State, and Oregon State had one of the best rushers in the country in his last name was Hankerson. Can't remember his first name. But Allah was like the change of pace back. He's a big 230-pound kid. averaged over 6 yards per carry. I think he's a nice addition. River Peppers is one of the guys that stayed, who's a redshirt freshman and was one of the highest rated recruits in Iowa State football history. He's a really high-level running back. And then Aiden Flora is another guy that kind of plays that H-back position for Iowa State. So I think between those four, it's going to be running back by committee, kind of like it was with Hansen and with Abu Sama or with the previous regime. You know, at receiver, they add Jordan Bailey, who TCU was really high on when he transferred to TCU, but he didn't see the field a ton last year. He transfers within the league. And then it's Evan Boyd, a transfer from Michigan State, who was a highly touted recruit for them, just really young. And then Carter Pabst, who's a Washington State guy. You know, he brought in almost 20 guys from Washington State. So, you know, it's kind of the bad news bears that they've thrown together to put a team on the field. But there are some pieces that it's like, okay, I could see them maybe finding 6 wins.
Here's what new coach Jamie Rogers said about the amount of transfers they're bringing in.
Yeah, we will return 44 players from last year's team to this year's team, 28 freshmen. 8 of those freshmen are currently mid-year enrollees, and then the 81 transfers. Now, all of these transfers aren't people that it's not like I don't know them. Several of these players came with me from Washington State, just like my initial move from South Dakota State to Washington State. I had brought 29 players from South Dakota State with me to Washington State. So, and then there are many players that made this transition again with me when I came here. And then obviously there's the relationships that we've had in the past with players that I've recruited or coaches on our staff have recruited that maybe we didn't get them in recruiting coming out of high school, and there was a prior relationship. As far as not had 81 meals with families, I've had 81 sit-down one-on-one meetings for every kid that's come through this building, as well as every player that left the building. I had the opportunity to meet the current team. That was maybe different this year than it was last year. I had the opportunity to sit down with our players one-on-one for 45 minutes to an hour and figure out the positives of Iowa State and things that they've liked, things that they enjoyed, things that they would want to see changed, and then just their overall feel if they were going to be entering the transfer portal or not. They were great. Many had decided to leave and go to Penn State or look for another home elsewhere, but I feel like we got the right group of guys to stay, guys that were passionate about staying here and continuing their career here at Iowa State. And then I'm excited about the guys that we were able to bring in. I know it's somewhat crazy to even think about putting together a team with 81 new players. At the end of the day, and I know nobody likes to hear this is the modern era of college football.
Yeah. Look, I mean, here's a coach that gets it. And that's a great, I think, piece. He was asked, this was when he was on with Urban Meyer, and Urban Meyer was like, all kind of hilarious from a standpoint of like, I can't believe we're talking about negotiating with kids here. And like, come on, Urban, don't act like you didn't pay players. Like, come on.
Right.
But Urban basically said, like, before I signed a kid, I would go and have a meal with them and their family. So did you have, with 81 transfers, did you have 81 meals? That's where he referenced the 81 meals piece. And he's like, well, I didn't have 81 meals, but I had 81 sit-downs.
81 sit-downs. That's a lot of meetings. I mean, that's a it's a detail-oriented, high-energy young coach thing to do that I think Iowa State fans, frankly, I think Iowa State fans are going to love this guy. I really do. He's blue-collared, he's a hard worker, he's high energy, and I think that we are going to see in his first year signs that he is the right guy for Iowa State. And remember, I mean, whether they knew Matt Campbell was leaving before it was public or not, they hired Jimmy Rogers immediately. It was almost a coincided announcement that Campbell was going to Penn State and Jimmy Rogers was going to be the next coach at Iowa State, which says a lot about Jamie Pollard and the fact that he's had his eye on him for some time. And his teams at South Dakota State were really good. And then that 1 year at Washington, I just feel like he is the perfect fit for Iowa State.
That's James Amari. Let's hear from Jimmy Rogers next. As our spring caravan rolls along in Ames, Iowa, we are presented in this spring road trip by Modelo touring Big 12 country, because the offseason does not mean off. It just means research. Jamie Rogers is next. It's Big 12 Today on Big 12 Radio. Heard on TuneIn, watched on Big 12 Studios.